Thanks, Elizabeth, and welcome along to church today. I want to begin by talking about Ravi Zacharias. Now, for those who may not have heard of him, Ravi Zacharias is one of the greatest Christian apologists of the last century. He wrote more than 30 books. He travelled the world defending answering objections to Christianity, and he founded Ravi Zacharias International Ministries, or RZIM, back in 1984, which now employs hundreds of people across the globe and receives well over $50 million in donations every year. He passed away in May last year at age 74, and US Vice President Mike Pence was at his funeral. Such was his fame. In September of last year, Christianity Today wrote an article outlining allegations of sexual abuse against Ravi from 3 massage therapists that he would regularly visit. RZIM initially denied the allegations, putting their full confidence behind their beloved founder and leader, yet they did do the right thing in hiring an independent legal company to do a thorough investigation into the claims. Their report was released by RZIM in February of this year, which said that they are confident that Ravi Zacharias did engage in serious sexual misconduct with dozens of women in the US and in Asia for well over a decade. The details they uncovered were sordid and extensive. The question that this devastating situation raises is, how could this happen? How could a Christian of such brilliance, such influence, and such world-renowned impact fall so hard? RZIM actually admitted in their report to what they think led to this disaster. And it's the exact same thing that Jesus rebukes his disciples for in our passage today. So in verse 17, it was just read for us, Jesus says, "You unbelieving and perverse generation." Now, what is shocking about this rebuke here is it's directed at the disciples. Right? He's not talking to the crowd here. The crowd have done nothing wrong. He's not talking to the Pharisees here. They're not on the scene. He's not talking to the Father here either, the Father's simply looking for help for his Son. Jesus is rebuking the disciples here. And the reason Ravi Zacharias fell so hard was because he failed to heed Jesus' warning in this passage. And if you and I don't heed Jesus' warning in this passage, we put ourselves in danger too, all right? Satan loves Christians who fail to heed the warning in this passage. And I've got 3 points to help us listen to, understand, and heed Jesus' warning in this passage, as your sermon outline shows. So we're going to begin by looking at the scene that Jesus is confronted with in this passage. And it's a scene that reminds us that our world is a world in chaos. So I've titled our first point, a hopeless situation. A hopeless situation, that's verses 14 to 16. We'll then look at Jesus' assessment of this situation and how he lays the blame at the disciples' feet. So I've called our second point a harsh rebuke. That's verses 17 to 20. However, Jesus does not leave the poor disciples in the gutter. In the second half of verse 20, he tells them how to avoid this situation happening in the future. And I've titled our third point a helpful lesson. But our goal for today is to learn how to avoid the enormous pitfall that too many a Christian have fallen into, including the disciples themselves, right? And instead be the kind of Christians that God uses to move mountains, verse 20. So let's dive in and look at a hopeless situation, a harsh rebuke, and a helpful lesson. And our passage picks up the narrative straight after the Mount of Transfiguration. So if you're here last week, you remember how Peter, James and John had the enormous privilege of seeing Jesus in all his glory. Yet following this wondrous high of heavenly glory comes this enormous low of a hopeless situation. Verse 14, when they came to the crowd, a man approached Jesus and knelt before him. "Lord, have mercy on my son," he said. "He has seizures and is suffering greatly." Now, modern medicine would probably diagnose this boy with epilepsy unless something else serious was going on in the brain. But the father says the seizures will often take the son when he's near fire or water. Now, my current understanding is when someone is having an epileptic seizure, all we can do is stop them from hurting themselves by hitting hard objects around them. But can you imagine what would have happened to this boy if his seizures were regularly causing him to fall into fire or fall into water? Right, so the father knows something a little more sinister than just epilepsy is going on here. And Jesus confirms this down in verse 18 when he rebukes the demon that was attacking the boy. Now, we don't have much experience with demon possession today. The reason being, Satan much prefers to work in the shadows. All right, as the saying goes, the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. You see, if demon possession were in the news every night, then Western society would actively be looking for ways to fight Satan, and Satan doesn't want that. So he keeps a low profile in order to work unhindered, unopposed. But here's the thing. When the Son of God was walking the earth, right, everyone was talking about the spiritual realm. There was no other explanation for the miraculous powers that Jesus was displaying. So it was actually pointless for Satan to be hiding back then. But on top of that, Satan had also mobilized his troops to combat Jesus' plans. I mean, God the Son was walking the earth. So Satan was in full attack mode back in Jesus' day. And this young boy is caught up in that. Can you imagine the father's concern? He could not leave his son alone for even a moment, for he knew the demon was trying to kill him. Right? Throwing him into seizures at the most dangerous of times. And so while Peter, James and John got a glimpse into the tranquil glory of heaven in last week's passage, they come back down to earth with a crash, being reminded firsthand of the chaos that rules this world. But what makes this situation doubly hopeless is that the 9 other disciples that weren't on the Mount of Transfiguration are unable to heal this boy. We hear that in verse 16. And this should come as a shock to us, okay? Because back in Matthew 10 verse 1, we were told this. Matthew 10, 1, Jesus called the 12 disciples to him and gave them authority to drive out evil spirits and to heal every disease and sickness. And in Luke 10:17, we're told very clearly that the disciples did just that. They healed the sick, all right, and they cast out demons. So this should have been a routine operation for them. It should have been simple. A couple of years ago, I was walking through a busy car park with my then 4-year-old. I was holding their hand tightly because they were jumping around and wanting to get away. But as they were jumping around, they did something to their elbow, like it was real serious pain. And I took them to the hospital, and the doctor looked at my child's arm, and what they did was they slowly bent it up. They turned their palm towards the floor and then straightened it. And the tendon that had popped out of place popped back into place. Just like that. Easiest hospital visit ever. It's actually called a nursemaid injury that's quite common in 1 to 4-year-olds. And friends, that's what should have happened here. Right? This was a routine operation, a dead simple operation for the disciples. They'd done it dozens of times before. Right, so not only do we have the hopelessness of demon possession in this passage, we also have the hopelessness of the disciples' failure. Right? What's going on in this hopeless situation? Well, whatever it is, Jesus isn't too impressed. Let me read verse 17 again. You unbelieving and perverse generation, Jesus replied, how long shall I stay with you? How long shall I put up with you? So like I said at the beginning, this rebuke is directed against the disciples, but figuring out exactly what they've done wrong is a little more tricky because Jesus' words here are quite vague and also quite confusing. So to begin with, verse 17, he says they're unbelieving. Now what does this mean? Well, it can't mean that they didn't believe they could do it. Right? They're truly perplexed in verse 19 about the fact that they couldn't do it. We're helped a little by the word perverse, all right? Now, the word perverse refers to a moral failure. So if we call someone a pervert, all right, that is because they have done something that is openly, morally objectionable, haven't they? So the disciples have done something wrong here with regards to their faith. The next piece of the puzzle comes in verse 20, which turns out to be just as confusing as verse 17. So the disciples ask Jesus in verse 19, why couldn't we drive it out? Jesus says in verse 20, because you have so little faith. Truly I tell you, if you have faith as small as a mustard seed, you can say to this mountain, move from here to there, and it will move. Nothing will be impossible for you. All right, well, thank you very much, Jesus. On the one hand, you say the reason the disciples couldn't drive the demon out is because they have so little faith. And then straight away you say, but a little faith is all you need to move mountains. All right, which is it, Jesus? Well, what Jesus is doing here is he's actually taking us back to the basics on faith. This is faith 101 here. It's the age-old principle. It's not the size of your faith that matters. It's what you put your faith in. And what the disciples had done wrong is they'd stopped relying on God and started relying on themselves. See, being part of Jesus' inner circle and being endowed with miraculous powers to cast out demons had made them arrogant. All right, they started to see themselves as God's gift to the world. In the movie Rush Hour, the LAPD detective James Carter is called up by the FBI to help with an important international case. Now, this guy is arrogant enough as it is, but he's on cloud nine after this. He struts into the crime scene. He throws his keys to one agent, says, park that for me, says to another agent, I need one of those earpieces immediately, and then says to the groom, all right, boys, give me the story. Have there been any demands about this case? He's brought back down to earth, however, by the agent in charge who tells him he's not there to help with the investigation. He's there to babysit Jackie Chan's character and keep him out of the way. And that's what's happened with the disciples here. They're strutting around thinking they're the FBI. And they can heal the sick or cast out demons in their own strength. And God brings them back down to earth with a crash. You can't fix this one, boys. And Jesus is not happy, all right? He has endowed them with special abilities. But those abilities do not come from them, they come from God. And so what the disciples have done wrong here is they have perverted their faith. They've twisted their faith. Saving faith is supposed to be in God. But the disciples have started to rely on themselves, put their faith in themselves and their own ability. And for that, they get a very harsh rebuke. Now, thankfully, Jesus does not end there. In the second half of verse 20, we get a very helpful lesson on what faith is supposed to be like. Let me read it for us again. Truly I tell you, if you have faith as small as a mustard seed, you can say to this mountain, move from here to there, and it will move. Nothing will be impossible for you. Now, what does he mean here? What does Jesus mean? Does Jesus mean that if we pray hard enough, all right, we can actually move a mountain? If we pray hard enough, God will move the New South Wales snowfields to be only a half hour away from Sydney rather than 3.5 hours away. Is that what he's talking about here? Well, no. Moving a mountain, right, it is an extreme example. Jesus is giving an extreme example of something that we have no hope of accomplishing ourselves. And Jesus' point here is that this is the key to faith. The key to faith is helplessness. Now let me say that again, because this is where Ravi Zacharias and Ravi Zacharias International Ministries got it so wrong. The lesson Jesus is trying to teach us here is that the key to faith is not holiness, it's not doing it all ourselves, it is helplessness. Let me explain. When RZIM released the report into Ravi's immoral behaviour, they said the number one factor in it going so wrong was a failure to keep Ravi accountable. RZIM simply trusted that this Christian giant was holy. All right, they thought nothing of Ravi taking trips to Asia each year alone. But as it turned out, he had several girlfriends there that he would visit. They never thought about keeping Ravi accountable with his phone or his internet. Ravi had been sent, as they found, hundreds of selfies of young women, some of them naked. And they thought nothing of giving Ravi access to tens of thousands of dollars in a discretionary humanitarian fund that actually came from donations. And the report showed that he had used that to pay for education, housing and monthly allowances for 4 massage therapists that he would see regularly. See, what they failed to realise is that Christians are thoroughly helpless when it comes to the chaos of this world. The key to faith is not moving mountains with our holiness. It is realising we are completely helpless to move mountains and beg for God's help. I mean, this is how you become a Christian, isn't it, to begin with? So you don't become a Christian by saying to Jesus, "Look how holy I am, Lord, now you have to save me." You become a Christian by admitting your utter helplessness with regards to your sin and begging for Jesus' help. All right, we sing about this, don't we? Naked, come to you for dress. Helpless, look to you for grace. Stained by sin, to you I cry. Wash me, Saviour, or I die. But friends, our helplessness does not stop at conversion. A life of faith is a life of saying, I do not have the strength to meet the moral or spiritual challenges of this chaotic world. Christians are never to say, I can move this mountain myself, thank you very much. And that is the height of pride. And as Proverbs 16:18 said, pride goes before destruction, a haughty spirit before a fall. Friends, a life of faith is admitting that we do not have the strength to cope with the moral and spiritual challenges of this chaotic world. So what do we do? Well, I want to give us 2 things by way of application today, 2 things that will help us avoid the disciples' moral failure. And the first is pray. We see this in verse 21. I actually asked someone in my Bible study to read out verse 21 for us this week. It was met with looks of confusion because there is no verse 21. Matthew 17 goes straight from verse 20 to verse 22. Now, truth be told, there is a verse 21, but it is not found in the earliest and most reliable manuscripts of Matthew's Gospel. Most scholars believe it was a late addition by a copyist who pulled it over from Mark's Gospel. And most Bibles, you will rightly find it in a text note. I think it's right to be in the text note. So if you have a look, it actually says this, but this kind does not go out except by prayer and fasting. Now, even though it's not part of Matthew's Gospel, it is part of Mark's Gospel, okay? But the principle is simple. Prayer and fasting show a reliance upon God. Now, the corollary of that is, if we don't pray very much as Christians, then we are by default relying on our own strength, aren't we? All right, a life of faith is a life of prayer. All right, pray about your sin. Beg for God's help. I was at a funeral many years ago of a Christian lady. Their daughter read out the prayer that they found in the front of her prayer diary. Right? This is what she'd pray every day. She would say, "Dear Lord, I'm doing okay with regards to sin today. I haven't gossiped or sworn. I haven't envied or been nasty. I haven't been selfish or impure. I'm doing pretty good. But in a minute, I'm going to get out of bed. And that's when I'm going to need your help." All right? Pray for God's strength with regards to our sin. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. We do not have the strength to deal with that ourselves. Pray for your ministry, whatever that is. Right? So it takes me, on average, about 12 to 14 hours a week to write a sermon. About 1.5 hours of that is spent solely in prayer for the sermon. One of our prayer leaders here spends an hour during the week just praying about what he's going to pray for up the front on Sunday. Brilliant. All right? If only the disciples had prayed rather than doing their ministry in their own strength. Right? Pray about your ministry. And then, after you've prayed about your sin and prayed about your ministry, pray about everything else. Everything else. Pray before you get in the car, before you go to work, before you mow the lawn, before you cook dinner. Pray about financial decisions, career decisions, family decisions. Remember that every single thing we don't bring before the Lord in prayer is something we're relying on our own strength to do. Right? A life of faith is a life of prayer. Second thing, for a life of faith, or a life of helplessness, requires accountability. Right? And accountability is particularly important when it comes to things like sex, money, or power. All right? So with regards to sex, get accountability software for all your online activities. All right? My accountability partners get a report every month on my computer and phone activities. Put big barriers between yourself and people of the opposite sex. Right? No women are allowed in my house if Deb's not home. And be wise when dating. Okay? Our above reproach covenant says our youth and children's leaders are not to spend uninterrupted alone time with their boyfriend or girlfriend. Put big barriers in place with sex. How about money? As much as we love and trust our treasurer here, Denise, our financials are audited every year. We love our money counters as well, but the money is counted every week by two people who are not married. And as for me, I don't touch any money here. I have no key for the safe. If anyone ever tries to hand me offertory, I say, "Can you put it in the offertory box yourself?" I'll take a check if it's made out to the church because I can't use that, all right? Be accountable when it comes to money. And then there's power, all right? We need to understand that every single person wields some sort of power in life. You may not wield power over everyone, but you will wield power over some people. Do not ever use your position to exploit another. The report showed that Ravi Zacharias would tell his Christian victims that if they ever spoke out, they would be responsible for millions of lost souls through his damaged reputation. That is a horrendous abuse of power. Right, friends, if you don't think you need accountability, then you're in denial as to our helplessness. Now, friends, we cannot be certain whether Ravi Zacharias died a Christian or not. I pray that he did. But from the evidence collected, we don't think he started out this way. What went wrong with Ravi and what went wrong with the disciples is that they failed to realise that the key to a life of faith is not holiness. It's not saying, "Look how good I am." It's helplessness. It's saying, "Look how helpless I am." Friends, may we live a life of faith through prayerful reliance upon God and through wise accountability from peers. For I tell you the truth, if you have faith as small as a mustard seed, you can say to this mountain, "Move from here to there," and it will move. Nothing will be impossible for you.